Hello, students. Professor Sexton here with the first of three video lectures for this week. I know the syllabus only lists two, one on writing a literary analysis essay, one on the poems My Last Duchess and The Japanese Wife, but I'm going to add an additional one that will be about your poetry paper and paper formatting and what to do with the bonus points. So the first one is about writing a literary analysis essay. This is a rather long document, but you can find it in course documents. I am not going to read the entire document to you verbatim because you can do that yourself. But there are some things that I do want to go over with in this video lecture with you about writing a literary analysis. So in addition to reading the document, you will also want to watch this video. So let me share the document with you and it'll come up on my screen now. So here we are. So this is the document. So just a few things that I want to highlight as you're reading this document. So keep in mind that the purpose of a literary analysis essay is for you to carefully examine and sometimes evaluate a work of literature. As with any analysis, it requires you to break the subject down into its component parts. And when you analyze a literary work, you are asking questions about it that are related to your main view of the work, the central ideal or thesis. In other words, you are giving the work meaning beyond what it tells you directly. So one of the things that I want you to always remember for the literary papers that you're writing in this paper, you're not summarizing them. So your job is not to tell me what happens in the literary work. I already know what happens in literary work because I can read that myself and see that. What I do not know is your particular take on the literary work. So what you're doing is you're giving me your interpretation, your analysis. So you want to make sure that that is what you're doing when you write any of the literary papers for this course. In order to write a strong literary paper, you need a central ideal or a thesis. And I know that a lot of teachers in the past may have emphasized that you need the central ideal or the thesis statement for your reader. However, it's my opinion that the central ideal of the thesis statement is more important to you as a writer than it is to the actual reader. Because by you having a central ideal or a thesis statement, it tells you what you need to include to prove your point. So that thesis statement governs what you do in that paper. So for instance, let's say that you were writing a paper about My Papa's Waltz, and you want to argue that the poem shows the complex relationship between a father and son. That's your thesis statement. That is what you want to prove. So everything that you include in that paper is going to work to prove that point. So when you have a thesis statement, it allows you to better shape your paper and your argument. It doesn't really matter where the thesis statement comes in the first paragraph. Some people begin with it, some people put it in the middle, some people put it in the end. Just as long as it's there is the most important thing for me. And on this paper, you'll see that there are examples of thesis statements for poetry paper, short story, and for drama. So for instance, let's just look at the one for poetry. Notice here it reads, Gwendolyn Brooks, the Ballad of Rudolph Reed, demonstrates the conventional poetic form of the ballad to treat the unconventional poetic subject of racial intolerance. This is the thesis statement and what this paper sets out to prove. So that lets the reader know, but more importantly, it lets the writer know that this is what he or she is working towards in this essay. And so one of the things that you also want to know about the thesis statement is that it needs to include the author full's name. So you notice here it has Gwendolyn Brooks and then the title of the literary work. And here you have the title of the poem. For poetry and for short stories, the literary works are in quotation marks. For plays and for novels, the literary work title is italicized. And so those are the things that you need to keep notice of there. Let's look at the second page of it. Here, I talk about the introduction. Writing an introduction is always difficult. for many writers. And one of the reasons I think that an introduction is difficult to write is that oftentimes we're writing an introduction to a paper that we've not written. So it's difficult to give an introduction when there's nothing there to begin with. However, when you do set out to do the introduction for literary work, what you want to do is you want to begin with a general idea or concept that is related to your main ideal or your thesis statement. And there are many ways to do this. You can use a quotation, you can use a question, a anecdote. And what an anecdote is, it's just a brief story that introduces the topic. Um, so there are many different ways that you can do this. Um, Once you start off with that general ideal or concept, then you transition from that to the literary work itself. And this is where, will be a good time to mention what your thesis statement is and what it is that you're going to prove about the literary work. Keep in mind here is where you want to give the full name of the author and also the complete title. And then the best way to end the introduction is by letting your reader know what points you're going to use to prove your thesis statement. So once again, I'm going to give you an example here, and this is an introduction for a poetry paper. So for instance, this one reads, and I'll make this a little bit larger. What would one expect to be the personality of a man who has his wife sent away to a convent, or perhaps has had her murdered because she took too much pleasure in the sunset and in a compliment paid to her by another man? So that begins with a question. And it's kind of like a general question because it's not a question that begins with the poem itself. It's just a general ideal or a concept that introduces what the paper is going to be about. It's the second sentence that introduces the poem and the thesis. It is just such a man, a Renaissance Duke, who Robert Browning portrays in his My Last Duchess. A character analysis of the Duke reveals that through his internal dialogue, his interpretation of earlier incidents, and his actions, that his traits, arrogance, jealousy, and greediness emerge. So this tells you the thesis statement of the paper. What the paper is going to focus on is going to be a character analysis of the Duke, and it tells you the points that the paper is going to use to show that character analysis. And it's going to be through interpretation of dialogue, earlier incidents, and his actions, and they're all going to be used to show his arrogancy, jealousy, and greediness. So this introduction works really well because it starts with a general concept, moves to the actual poem, and then lets the reader know what the paper is going to focus on. And more importantly, it lets the writer know what it is that she has to show evidence of in this paper. There's another example for short story. So that's something you can read as well, or maybe something that you'll go back to when you do the short story paper. Here are some introduction don'ts. Don't begin the introduction with a formal announcement, such as my paper is going to be about, or I'm writing about, or I chose to write it on topic 2. You don't need to do that. That's unnecessary. And try not to use throwaway phrases such as in my opinion, I think, I believe, I feel. It's your paper, so the reader already knows that these are your opinions, what you think, what you believe, and what you feel. So you don't need to include that. These are crutches that oftentimes when you start to use them, you overuse them. And so try to avoid using them altogether. Um, in the body of the essay, you present the paragraphs. And on this document, I say a minimum of 3. Depending on some paper assignments, 2 might be sufficient, but 3 is usually a good number. And sometimes you'll have more than 3. But these individual paragraphs are going to support your thesis statement. And this is where you give explanation of your ideas by using textual evidence. So if you go back to the one about My Last Duchess, where you talk about internal dialogue, you can have a whole body paragraph on internal dialogue, and then you can have another paragraph on the interpretation of earlier incidents, and yet another paragraph on his actions. The thing that you need to keep in mind about a body paragraph, each body paragraph needs to have one topic. And this is a topic, I mean, and normally a body paragraph has a topic sentence, which operates just like a thesis statement. What it does is it tells the reader and it also tells you what the focus is going to be in this paragraph. So everything in that paragraph needs to be related to that focus. So if you're doing the Duchess, My Last Duchess, and you're focusing on an internal dialogue, then everything in that in that paragraph needs to relate to internal dialogue. And what you're doing here is you're using information from the literary work to support your viewpoint. And so this is where you start to use quotations. So, for instance, on the top of the third page here, this is the one about the short story about John Updike's The A&P. What you have in yellow is the topic sentence. So the topic sentence reads, Sammy's description of the A&P presents a setting that is ugly, monotonous, and rigidly regulated. The chain store is a common fixture in modern society, so the reader can identify with the uniformity Sammy describes. So that's the topic sentence that tells your reader what this paragraph is going to be about. But then the rest of this is textual support, where what the writer does is then goes to the literary text and pick out certain scenes or certain things mentioned in the text to prove the point that she has made about the setting being ugly, monotonous, and rigidly regulated. And so you want the bulk of each body paragraph to be this green section, which is the textual evidence. But in addition to just giving the textual evidence, you have to also explain how that works to prove your thesis, your topic sentence. And then the last part of your paper is the conclusion. And the conclusion gives your paper a sense of completeness. It reminds your reader of the general ideal or concept. It touches upon the topics that you have used in the body paragraphs. However, the conclusion needs to do more than simply repeat what you have already stated. I know that oftentimes when we've been taught to write conclusions, we've been told that we just need to repeat what we've stated in the paper. But those type of conclusions are dull because they're just simply repeating what you've already stated. And so what you want the conclusion to do is you want the conclusion to move your argument forward, to give your reader a new way of thinking about what you have presented, to go back and treat some of those things and kind of look at it differently to show how your literary analysis has perhaps answered that question. Remember when the sample introduction with the Duke began with that question. So a good way for a conclusion for that paper, if you begin with a question, is to return to that question, but this time to answer that question. So you want to have this sense of uniformity when you're doing the conclusion. And for instance, here's a way that here's an example of one. If the Duke has any redeeming qualities, they fail to appear in the poem. Browning's emphasis on the Duke's traits of arrogance, jealousy, and materialism makes it apparent that anyone who might have known the Duke personally would have based his opinion on him on these three personality flaws. Ultimately, the reader's opinion of the Duke is not a favorable one, and it's clear that Browning intended the reader to feel this way. Notice how this conclusion picks up on some of the same points that was made in the introduction, yet it presents it in a very different way. And what it does is it assumes that the reader has already read the person's argument and then it's bringing the reader along with him. So that's what you want to do as well. Here are some conclusions. Don't begin your conclusion with a statement like in conclusion, to conclude, in summary, or to sum up. That's unnecessary. We often use those when we're doing oral presentations, and we do them in oral presentations because our audience often doesn't know that we're coming to the end of the presentation. So sometimes we have to let them know by saying in conclusion. But with a paper where the reader has the paper in front of him, he knows that it's the last page and he knows that it's the conclusion. So you don't have to tell him in conclusion. And notice how the conclusion up above doesn't use in conclusion, to conclude, or in summary, or to sum up. So try to avoid doing that. Also, what you want to do is don't apologize in your conclusion. Sure, you may have doubts about your literary analysis of the paper, but that's totally fine. And that's totally fine and it's natural. Don't apologize. This is your interpretation. So don't say, this is just my opinion or I might be wrong. All of that is unnecessary. Um, be confident and proud in what you worked on and what you presented in the paper. Um, so some other things here is about titles. I want your papers to have titles. And what a title does is it gives your reader some indication of what your paper is going to be about. And it's a way to grab the reader's attention. However, you don't want it to be so specific that it tells the reader what the paper is about, but you kind of want it to work as a tease. Like, so for instance, you have two here, like, for instance, one, Robert Browning's Duke, a portrait of a sinister man. So that title lets you know that the paper is going to be about the Duke and let you know that the Duke is sinister, but it doesn't give you all the information about him. That way, the person has to read the paper. And notice that the second one is the A&P state of mind, setting in John Updike's A&P. Once again, this kind of tells you that the paper is going to be about the setting, and it doesn't give you a lot of information, but it gives you just enough. Um, Here's some titles. Don't make your title paper one or just the literary title of the work itself. And you do not need to underline, bold type, or italicize your title. You only underline or italicize titles of literary works if you include them in your title. Um, One last few other things to remember. Your audience for this paper is me. So, I mean, and let's just be realistic. I'm the one who's going to read it, but I've already read everything that you're writing about. So, to that end, you don't need to summarize the literary work. You don't need to tell me what happened in the work. That I already know. What I do not know is your particular focus on the literary work. I do not know how you read it. I do not know your analysis. And so you want to make sure that as you're working on this paper and in the body paragraph specifically, you want to make sure that you're giving me your analysis of the work and not just what happened in the work. And some final things that you should know, use the author's last name throughout the paper. So the first time you'll use the full name, like for instance, Gwendolyn Brooks or William Shakespeare. But for every other time, you'll use the author's last name where you'll say Brooks or Shakespeare. And then you want to use the present tense. So you'll use things such as Brooks explores, Browning questions, or Updike critiques. This is called the literary present. And what happens is, the belief is that literary works are assumed to exist in a central in an internal present. Therefore, when you write about what the author is doing in the literary work and what is happening in the work, including characters, actions, and thoughts, you must use the present tense. And this one is tricky because I know our initial thought is to use the past tense. So just be aware of this when you're writing your paper, that you do want to use the present tense when writing about what happens in a literary work. And then there are a few other things here to keep in mind. Um, this just explains where there are a few exceptions. Like sometimes there are times where you'll have to use the past tense. If you're talking about a historical moment of a literary work, or if something in the work happens before something else. And there's some examples here of both of those things. So I know that there's a lot of information here. I didn't go over all of it with a fine tooth comb. And what you'll need to do is you'll need to reread this document for yourself, word for word. And that way it will help you as you're working on not only this first paper assignment, but also the second and third paper assignment for the course. All right, everyone, stay well. And I will, quote unquote, see you in the next 2 video lectures.